Welcome to it. The 7 p.m. It's in the book literature study meeting. My name is Eileen and I am an alcoholic. Hey, everybody. Please join me in a moment of silent meditation to reflect on why we are here, followed by the serenity prayer. Serenity prayer? God, grant me the serenity to stop things I cannot be, the courage change things I've done, and the wisdom to know the difference. Okay. And I have Meredith now as our discussion leader.
Hey, everybody. My name is Meredith. I'm an alcoholic. Would you mind getting the door? Thank you. Thanks so much. All right. We're in the beginning of the book-ish. My first sponsor had me get this book and read it on my own, as well as once a week with her to find myself in these pages. And she simply said to me, if you can find yourself in the first few chapters, that the solution that's offered in this book will work for you. And she was very matter of fact about it. And I was like, okay, whatever you say, I'll give it a chance, because I was really desperate. And so the preface tells us that it's a textbook, which is something we study from and put into practice. It talks about a program that's outlined in this book, and the program is not going to meetings. The program is these 12 steps. Okay. The meetings are fellowship, and this is the 12-step program. Then it tells us in the forward to the first edition that we have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, which tells us right off the bat we're mentally and physically ill. They waste no time telling us we're pretty sick. All right. And they say mind and body, mind comes first. This illness centers in our minds. It starts there. And because we have an allergy, once we start to drink, we can't physically control how much. And that allergy fuels the obsession, and it goes around and around and around. The more I drank, the more I obsessed in between drinks and in between drunks. And then I couldn't keep that obsession away after a while, even though my best decision was I'm not going to drink today. So we're mentally and physically ill. It tells us that this program was found by mistake. Bill Wilson learned about the allergy from Dr. Silkworth when he was in his third treatment. He actually had 4 treatments. So treatment didn't really work for Bill. And he realized when he was at off at a business meeting that he was in danger of drinking again. And he realized he had to share his message with somebody else in order to save himself. Now, the previous 6 months, he'd been going out to everybody saying, I've got an answer. You got to hear this great answer. It's God, blah, blah, blah. It's God. And the doctor said, why don't you get off the God thing and talk about the illness? And when he did that, when he realized it was really about saving his own life, he actually worked. And he and Dr. Bob, that at that point forward, started putting this unique experience before the world. They ended up writing a book outlining these 12 steps in detail, because they didn't want the message to be garbled beyond recognition if they just passed it along by mouth. They wanted to memorialize it in a book so that it would be the same everywhere. And that's why in 67 languages, the 12 steps are the 12 steps. And so, in fact, that's what the forward to the third edition is about. We get to the doctor's opinion, which explains a little more in detail. This doctor who worked at Towns Hospital and treated 50,000 or so alcoholics, he developed this theory about the allergy, which is they knew there was something wrong with the way we think, because we would be chained to a wall for a few days and detox, and they'd turn us back out and we'd drink again. And they couldn't, like, we know they got to be mentally screwed up because they keep going back to the poison that's killing them, even though they don't want to. But he said there's also a physical component that once they start, they don't have any control over the amount they take. And that he called an allergy, which is an abnormal reaction to any food, beverage, or substance that does not affect most people. And he went on to say that it only happens with alcoholics, meaning when my friend Linda drank, she has 1 drink, maybe 2, and says, oh, I need to stop. I feel like I'm losing control. Or it's making me sleepy. And I'm like, I have 2 drinks and I'm ready to do shots. The party's just getting started. So her physical reaction is completely different than mine. And I had to understand that because I really thought I had a problem of not being able to control my willpower. I thought it was a matter of being weak-willed. I didn't know there was this physical component overrides my best thinking. So it was important for me. This book really helped me diagnose myself. So doctor's opinion explains all that in great detail. And then we get into Bill's story. Now, Bill's story's in the front of the book because it's like a written 12-step call. It's like a speaker meeting in print. Okay. The idea is hear somebody's story, see if you can find identification. And so we read Bill's story and we find out what he was like, what happened, and what he was like after he took these steps. And we try to find ourselves in these pages. So as we read Bill's story, and we're going to start on page 7, but we're just going to do a quick recap. If I'm going to look for identification and the progression of the illness, then I should try to find something in these pages in the story that I can line up with. All right, we're starting on page 7, where he says that it relieved in the middle of the book. He talks about the middle of that page. He talks about how a doctor told him, "Hey, you're actually bodily and mentally ill, and that's why you have this drinking problem. And it's not just because you have low character or anything like that." So he explained his incredibly bad behavior. And he's telling himself, now I understand myself. I've got the answer, self-knowledge, right? But it says it wasn't because the frightful day came when I drank once more. That's the other thing. When you get to the point where you really know you can't drink anymore, you really know you got to be done. You're going to end up in jail. You're going to end up in treatment. You're going to end up somewhere real bad, and you still drink. And it's a desperate experiment. You don't want to, but you don't know how to not do it. Okay? So that's where we are. And she has just been told, and they've just been told that he'll probably end up with a wet brain or dying in delirium tremens from a heart attack or something.
Huh.
Great news.
Great news. Cliffhanger.
Yeah.
He recovers. They did not need to tell me. I knew and almost welcomed the idea. It was a devastating blow to my pride. I, who had thought so well of myself and my abilities, of my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last. Now I was to plunge into the dark, joining the endless procession of sots who had gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What would I not give to make amends? But that was over now. No words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in the bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched all around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had become overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. Then came the insidious insanity of that first drink. And on Armistice Day, 1934, I was off again. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere or would stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passed.
Okay. So they tell him he's probably going to die, and he says, I almost welcome the idea. You ever have those mornings where you wake up and just say, it's too bad I woke up? The speaker that I love says, dying was an acceptable consequence. And then it says, it goes on page 8, his pride is now wounded because he thought so well of himself. He was a self-made man, and there were a lot of the great things he did do, but he couldn't overcome this. And it talks about in this book how pride, ego must be deflated and stay deflated long enough for us to connect the dots and embrace a solution. And he even says, now he's feeling sorry for himself. I'm going to end up like that endless procession of sots, which are habitual drunkards. And that wasn't what he was aiming for when he came out of the army. And literally depressed, right? I don't know anybody that doesn't come in here depressed because we hate what's happened to our lives. And alcohol's a depressant. And then it talks about this loneliness and despair in the bitter morass of self-pity. And then he says, I'd been overwhelmed. Alcohol is my master. So he realizes that he's powerless over alcohol. That should do it. That's step 1. And it says, trembling I stepped from the hospital, a broken man, broken, powerless, fear sobered him for a bit. The whole idea of dying from this, or maybe, disappointing his wife, whatever the fear was rooted in, sobered him for a bit. I was deathly afraid one time after bouncing my car into the other lane. And if another car had been coming, I'd have killed somebody. I didn't care if I died, but I realized I could have killed somebody, and it terrified me. And that fear lasted 3 days. Stayed sober 3 days on that fear. All right. So it sobers us for a bit, whatever that bit is, but it doesn't work forever. Self-will doesn't work. Fear doesn't work. And he says here, but then he was off again. And He'd been talking to this guy on a bus about him being alcoholic all the way out to the golf club on this Armistice Day. He's talking about how he can't drink. He has a ginger ale at the first place they stop. I can't drink. I'm an alcoholic. And then the next time they sit down, the bartender says, and the guy says, "Are you crazy?" And he said, "Well, yes, I am." Just like that, his mind has changed. And what kills me is everyone became resigned to the certainty I would be shut up somewhere or stumble off to a miserable end. That is certain for alcoholics of our type if we keep going. We're not certain. We're not certain of a recovery. We can be more certain of this end than we can be of recovery. That's a fact. And that's, until we understand that as a fact for us, because some of us still have some nice crap when we get here. I still had a BMW and I had a house and I had a nice job, but I hated myself and I wanted to die every day. So I was sick enough to want to get better. I also saw that it was getting worse quickly. So it says here, but then he says, how dark is before the dawn, very dramatic, right? Then he's, in reality, the beginning of his last debauch, soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. All right. And then it says, I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more useful. We know happiness, peacefulness, and usefulness as long as we grasp and develop this way of life. If we start and don't continue, we will slide back to the misery. The only thing that works for us continually is this practical program of action. It works more than any other treatment has for alcoholics. Other things have worked. Some psychiatrists do have some success with people. Sometimes people can get sober through their church, but most of the recoveries of alcoholics occurs through the process of the 12 steps and staying in that as a new way of life. I love that. I will know it if I'm in this way of life. If I drift in this way of life, I won't know it as often. It'll be elusive. Life will become dissatisfying again. I'll start to wonder what's the purpose. All right. Comments, experience.
Thank you.
And this thing about the loneliness, I realized I wasn't talking with anybody about that loneliness. I can stay in my head and tell myself it's not that bad. I'm not as bad as that one. Not as bad as that one, because I'm rationalizing it to me and only me. No, I'm not sharing it with anybody that can actually help me. So I can let that delusion go a lot longer because I'm not exposing it. And that's another thing that's really good about being friends with. You said I got around a bunch of really good alcoholics. Somebody said that. Nothing like a good alcoholic to hang around with. The ones that the lampshade wears, the ones every now and then some say, I'm glad we didn't drink together. It's like gasoline. But we're the ones that we went for it, man. And so we find that same kind of, it's almost like it's 500 miles out, it's 500 miles back. We're going to get just as good on this other side. But it takes putting something into it. It costs us something, and it costs us our pride, and it costs us our self-will, and it costs us these things that we've been operating on all of our lives. And that's why this resignation has to come, this sense of, I'm done. It's no longer fighting it. It's not fighting it. It's the not fighting it, which took me a long time to understand. Same thing.
Only an alcoholic. The not fighting it, having a sponsor really helps with that because they set you straight. If you don't have a sponsor and you're trying to work this program, you're not going to be doing a good job because we tell ourselves all sorts of lies and then we believe them. And a sponsor will help us see the truth, and that I can still remember some of the really shocking things she said to me, and they were hurtful, but they got my attention and they were true. The more they stung, the more truth to them. And I think we kind of need to be shocked out of our complacency. Like, this is a disease that will kill you and others if you don't get a handle on it. Anyway, that's it.
Okay. Well, let's read something.
Okay. Near the end of that bleak November, I sat drinking in my kitchen. With a certain satisfaction, I reflected there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through that night and the next day. My wife was at work. I wondered whether I dare hide a full bottle of gin near the head of the bed. I would need it before daylight.
Okay, so bleak November. Is there any other kind? And this is where it begins on what happened. This whole part before was what he was like, and now we're getting to what happened. I think it's interesting that he says enough gin to carry me through. That's what a higher power would do, right? Carry us through. And he's admitting I would need it before daylight.
Okay. My musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. He was sober. It was years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition. I was amazed. Rumor had it that he had been committed for alcohol insanity. I wondered how he had escaped. Of course he would have dinner. He would have dinner, and then I could drink openly with him. Unmindful of his welfare, I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. There was that time he had chartered an airplane to complete a jag. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility. The very thing, an oasis. Drinkers are like that. The door opened and he stood there, fresh-skinned and glowing. There was something about his eyes. It was inexplicably different. What had happened? I pushed a drink across the table. He refused it. Disappointed but curious, I wondered what had gotten into the fellow. He wasn't himself. Come, what's all this about? I queried. He looked straight at me, simply but smilingly. He said, I've got religion. I was aghast. So that was it. Last summer, an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspected a little cracked about religion. He had that starry-eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire, all right. But bless his heart, let him rant, because my gym would last longer than his preaching.
Okay. It's funny that he says my musing. He's thinking about where his booze is, and a musing is usually a lofty, poetic sort of thought. And this is just about where's the gym, right? And then, the old friend, he was sober, in italics. Unbelievably, this guy who was a drunk all of his life with him is sober. And he obviously doesn't think he couldn't have gotten sober. He must, he couldn't have been released. He must have escaped. He actually thinks that's the only logical explanation, that he escaped, which I think is very funny. And then he says, I'm unmindful of his welfare. He's looking back on this and thinking that. But at the time, he's thinking, great, we're going to drink. This is great, my old friend. It won't be so bleak anymore. And, the dreary desert of futility. We look at our lives and, a desert is not a fun place. And then it says he stood there fresh-skinned and glowing, the evidence of a psychic change. People see it in us, sometimes before we see it in ourselves. But that's the evidence. He sees something different. And it says it's inexplicable. He can't put his finger on it. He can't put his finger on it. And of course he says, I've got religion, because that's what they said back then. Now we say I've had a spiritual awakening or a psychic change. And then he says, I was aghast, which means filled with shock, amazement, and or terror. Okay, so it's a mixed emotions. And it says he had that starry-eyed look. And I don't know about you, but when I first got sober, I had to go to meetings out of town. And I went to this one meeting in Myrtle Beach all the time. And there was this guy who had these sparkling eyes. And I started to see that in AA meetings, there'd at least be one with sparkling eyes. And I knew that the light was on for them, and it gave me hope. So he's got the starry-eyed look. He's worried he's going to get preached at. But and he's saying, the plain language says, I'm going to hear a long, passionate speech about God. But what happens instead is it gives Bill a chance to reflect, which is something else we don't do unless we're kind of cornered. All right, we're going to leave it right there. Thanks, everybody, for a good meeting.
Thanks,